Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome back to day 3 of UAI, day 2 of the main conference. We are excited to start off today with our second keynote talk. Julie Josse is a senior researcher at INRIA in Montpellier in France, where she leads a joint team with INSERM on AI for personalized medicine. Julie had previously been a professor at the École Polytechnique and also had positions at Stanford and Google Brain, among other places. She's known primarily for her work on missing data and causal inference and applications of machine learning and AI in the clinic. And we're very excited to have her here with us today to open up day 2. So thank you, Julia.
Okay, so good morning. So first I would like to thank Emma and Dan and the organizer and Sarah and Sylvia for the invitation and the organization of this nice event. I'm very glad to be here. So today I will speak about the Traumatrix project, which consists in improving trauma triage and resources allocation with uncertainty-aware data science. And for me, this can be viewed as a comprehensive case studies of the different steps and challenges involved in bringing machine learning models from development to clinical deployment. Because the Traumatrix project is on its way of being deployed. So in September, it will be deployed in 16 regions in France across 150 hospitals. So I'm a bit scared. And to give you a preview of the main message, the model itself is only a small part of the overall effort. But before starting, I would just like to give you a brief introduction of my team, so Premedical, for personalized medicine by data integration and causal learning, so which is a joint team between INRIA, so the French National Research Center in Digital Science, and INSERM, the French National Research Center in Health. I just do a bit of ad also because we have a position of PhD students and postdoc. So we are composed of 25 researchers in statistics, biostatistics, AI, and clinicians. And we develop methods that covered some part of the data life cycle. So from the storage of data with the development of federated learning techniques to be able to learn from decentralized data, such as decentralized hospitals, while outputting results as if the data would have been centralized. And beyond storage, we also analyze the data with the specificity of developing methods to handle missing values, which are exacerbated as soon as you have multimodal and multi-source data. And we also specialize in developing causal inference techniques, and in particular for policy learning, so to know which treatment to give to each person at the right time. And so our aim is also to give new evidences, to bring treatment to the market faster, and to rethink the future of meta-analysis and randomized control trials. And we are doing this while ensuring the privacy of the data, which is of course crucial given the sensitivity of the medical data that we deal with. So we have different application domains, from neurodegenerative disease to fertility. And today I will present a collaboration with ICU clinicians taking care of trauma patients. So trauma patients are patients with injuries that pose an immediate threat to life or a limb. And so it includes traumatic brain injury or hemorrhagic shock resulting from car accidents, falls, or issue with a weapon. And this is a major health issue because this is a major cause of death and disability worldwide, and especially among young adults. And so these patients require specific care in what is called trauma centers, so specific hospitals, and in particular, level 1 trauma centers. And of course, the earlier they have access to resources like blood resources, specialists, emergency surgery, the greater their chance of survival and functional recovery. Because we have to keep in mind that the pathway of a trauma patient is quite long, so from the accident to the admission at the hospital, then they will go through rehabilitations, and then after, your aim is really that they can come back to life, to work life, and to be as autonomous as possible. And consequently, handling trauma patients is quite challenging because there will be many stakeholders along this pathway. You can have a lot of issues in terms of communication, so information that are not transmitted from one scene to another. And then the routing decision must be made very early with incomplete information and before complete diagnosis. Because in the ambulance, you just don't have all the machine to have an idea of what is the status of your patients. And so the decisions must also be made in a very stressful environment where every minute counts. And it turns out that the studies have shown that even experienced clinicians have a lot of difficulties in assessing the severity of the patients. So for instance, it's a bit complicated to see when you have an internal bleeding. And in addition, you have fatigue, you have cognitive load, and consequently, there are a lot of errors, and so there are many severe patients that are not routed to the appropriate level 1 trauma centers. And so it will lead to some under-triage, and so to huge human cost. But on the other hand, if you think that uncertainty can lead clinicians to adopt a precautionary approach, and so to be conservative, then you will not have like under-triage, but you will have over-triage. And this is also problematic because it will lead to huge economical cost, because you are going to mobilize, it's less problematic, but it's still problematic, you are going to mobilize teams, specialized teams, and also resources. So that's why the questions was to know like, if machine learning can help to improve the triage of trauma patients. So really to be able to anticipate the needs before complete diagnosis, to alert the right centers, and then to prepare the appropriate resources before the patient arrivals. So nearly like 10 years ago, Tobias Goss, the ICU clinicians leading the Traumatrix projects, contacted me, he presented me these challenges, and more precisely, he told me that to improve triage, we can focus on 2 key outcomes, so hemorrhagic shock and emergency neurochirurgy, so predict whether a patient will experience hemorrhagic shock within 24 hours, and predict whether urgent neurochirurgical interventions is required within 24 hours. And so he gave me the clinical definitions, and that the key constraint that both model has to rely exclusively on pre-hospital features, so variables available at the accident sites or in the ambulance to be able to take early decisions and to do the appropriate routing early. So from a kind of statistical machine learning point of view, it does not seem so complicated because this is simply classification problems. I have 2 binary outcomes, hemorrhagic shock, no hemorrhagic shock, neurochirurgy, no neurochirurgy. I have access to a quite large tabular data because we have a French observational registry containing more than 65,000 patients from 2011 and 2026. I have around like 300 features from pre-hospital settings, 40 trauma centers, 4,000 new patients per year. And here I have represented an extract of the data, so you can see the center. Then I have a patient with this kind of accident, a fall. I have like clinical information, blood pressure, lactate. Then I have my variable shock, yes or no. And so consequently, we have decided to select like 3 based models. So we have used like probability forest from the GRF package and also XGBoost. First, because it is in agreement with state-of-the-art that says that basically 3 base methods are still very competitive for tabular data. And second, because as I will show later, these methods allow me to handle quite different sources of uncertainty. We have also compared these methods to simplest baseline, such as logistic regression, which is, of course, very important. And in fact, it already achieved excellent predictive performance. And out of curiosity, I have also tested tabular foundation models. But basically, Tobias contacted me not only to build predictive models, but because he knew that at that time I was working a lot on missing values, and the trauma-based data, as many clinical data, has a lot of missing values. So here I have represented a bar plot representing for a subset of variables, representing the percentage of missing values for these features. And you can see that it varies a lot, so from 0 for some variables to nearly 80% for other variables. And of course, it's not possible to delete the observation with missing values because it can lead to some bias if you delete a subpopulation, but it may also lead to the deletion of almost all your data. So I like this example where I consider that I have a data with D features where each entry is missing with the probability 0.01. Then if you have like 5 features, complete case analysis will result in keeping almost 95% of your data. But as soon as you have like 300 features, complete case analysis will result in keeping around like 5% of your data. So this is not a possibility. Then, in the trauma base, there is a specificity because you can see here that in my bar plot, I have different colors representing different codes because it turns out that the medical doctors have encoded the reason for the lack of data. So, for instance, sometimes it is written like ND, it was non disponible in French, so it's simply because they have just forgotten to fill the form because it is a form, it's not recorded automatically. But sometimes it is written like IMP for impossible because the state of the patient was such that it was impossible to make the measurements. So this will highlight some very low or very high values. So we can see that it can be seen as an informative missing values. And of course, the clinicians, they were not aware really of the terminology of missing completely at random, missing at random, and so on. So they have used their own terminology. And then we had also a specific code like NA for not applicable. And this one was not really a real missing values in the sense that it does not hide an underlying values, but it was more some kind of coding issues. So to understand this, let's look at an example where I can have non-applicable when I have nested questions. So I have a first question, which is a treatment, osmotherapy, either you are treated or not. Then I have another feature, another variable, which is a treatment type. So for instance, SSH or mannitol. Then if I have a patient with no osmotherapy, so no in the first questions, then in the second question, it was written not applicable. So indeed, it's not a missing values because it does not make sense to impute a value for this patient. I cannot impute SSH or mannitol because he has no treatment. And so consequently, to handle this kind of fake missing values, you can use different strategies. And me, I have just used some kind of recoding. So instead of having 2 features, I created 1 feature with 3 categories. So either no treatment, or treatment SSH, or treatment osmotherapy. I also add this kind of non-applicable missing values when, for instance, I have a patient with cardiac arrest, then heart rate was non-applicable. And so this you can do like a clinically meaningful imputations, for instance, by imputing by 0. So for these non-applicables that are really not real missing values, and I insist because you cannot deal with classical methods to handle this kind of missing values, we have done this. But for all the other code, in fact, I have used like the theory that we have developed at that time that basically state that for a predictive problem, imputing by a constant can be Bayes optimal. And so this completely simplifies the implementation and the deployment of our model. So consequently, for XGBoost, I have imputed the missing values by the mean for the numeric features and by a missing category, so a new category, missing, for categorical variables. And then for probability forest, I have used the missing incorporated in attributes methods, which is a method which is embedded within the construction of the tree, but very similar to a kind of mean imputations and targeting the same aim. And for me, this was a bit like surprising at that time to do this, because at that time I had spent my life saying to people, if you have missing values, please never impute by the mean, because mean imputation is the worst thing that you can do, because basically mean imputation destroys joint and marginal distribution. And it's easy to see this with this example. So it's just a simulated bivariate data with a Gaussian distribution. I have a positive structure of correlation between x1 and x2 and a correlation coefficient equal to 0.6. Then I introduce a lot of missing values in one variable. It is here NA for not available, and it's represented in blue. I impute the missing values with the mean of the observed values. And so the imputed values are represented in blue. I have now a complete data set. On this complete imputed data set, I can do some statistics. For instance, I can estimate the mean, the standard deviation, and the correlation coefficient of my variable x2. And you can see that the mean is perfectly preserved because the population mean was 0. It makes sense. The standard deviation is too low because basically you have less variability in this imputed data rather than in your observed data because you impute with the same values. And the correlation coefficient is biased towards 0, which makes sense. So that's why we say that mean imputation deforms joint and marginal distributions. And of course, this is just a toy example, but I can assure you that the consequences of such an approach can be completely dramatic in practice. But this is the case because here I was looking at an inferential aim. I was estimating parameters given the fact that I had missing values. And so if you want to estimate parameters, for instance, the coefficient of your logistic regression and their variance, despite the fact that you have missing values and give confidence intervals with a good coverage, then mean imputation is completely catastrophic. But if you want to predict, so predict as well as possible an outcome, given the fact that you have missing values in the covariates, then mean imputation is fine. So it really depends on your aim. And at that time, we have created a website, ArmiStatic, where we try to put different resources on missing values, pipelines of analysis, tutorials, implementations to give the users a key to enter the field if they face missing values. And we have listed more than 150 implementations. So it really means that there is not a unique solution to handle missing values, but it depends on your aim. Your aim can also be a matrix completion aim if you want to recover as well as possible the missing entries in your matrix, or to recover as well as possible the distribution of your data. So let's look a bit more precisely into this predictive aim. So here I introduce some notation. So I have denoted X, the data, the complete data, X tilde, the data with missing value. So it is equal to X when it is observed and to NA for not available when it is missing. M is the indicator matrix coding for missing values, so 0 when it's observed and 1 when it's missing. And if I want to do supervised learning, I will find a regression function that minimizes the expected risk. And so the best regression function is known as the Bayes rule. And here what you can see is that your functions will take as an input not X, but X tilde. And X tilde does not live in a vectorial space, but rather in a mix between continuous and categorical data. So it's a semi-discrete space. And that's what makes the learning a bit complicated. And so when you write your Bayes predictor with a square loss, it can be written as conditional expectation of y given X tilde. And basically, this can be rewritten as one model per pattern of missing values. And so here I have represented like 2 patterns because I have like observed, missing, observed, and missing, observed, observed over the 2 power 3 because I have 3 features pattern. And so we can see that it's not necessarily trivial at the beginning because we have a combinatorial issues. I need as many models as I have patterns of missing values. But it turns out that we have shown that if you impute your training set with a constant, and then if you apply your learner, if you impute your test set with the same constant and then you predict, then it is based optimal if you have a universally consistent learner. So basically, if you are a super powerful learner able to learn anything for any distributions, then this strategy is consistent. And the rationale is really that you see the missing values as a specific code. And so for categorical variable, it's a new code, like missing. And so for continuous and numeric data, it's a constant, but it can be like even an out-of-range constant. And so your learner will detect the code at the train time, and he will recognize this code at the test time. And so that's why it's very important to impute with the same constant, because you don't want to have any distributional shift. And so basically what happens is that it's going to be able to de-identify the missing value, so to recover the missing data pattern from the imputed data. So basically to go very close to one model per pattern of missing values. And so, of course, this is an asymptotic result. You need a lot of data. But for me, it was really interesting because it was justifying this common practice that people were using, in fact, imputing by a mean. And that was a practice which is very bad for imputations. And so it justified it for a predictive purpose. And so you can see that, yes, this paper, it has, for me, it was a nice paper because of this, because it was justifying a common practice, but it was very long to publish, because for the people in the inferential community, they were saying, like, no, it's impossible to say that mean is good. And then in the predictive community, they were, oh, it may be too trivial, the result. So it was a bit weird. But for me, this was interesting for this. And then former postdoc, Marine Le Morvan, has extended this result not only to constant imputations, but to any deterministic imputation. So for instance, imputation by conditional mean, so by a regression. And so basically, the result is as follows. So if you have like my imputation function that I will denote phi, my learner that I will denote G star, then under weak assumptions that if my outcome is generated as a function of the feature plus some noise, then for all missing data mechanism and almost all imputation function, impute and regress is Bayes optimal. So basically, it means that asymptotically, you do not need to impute well to predict well. But just to, regarding the talk of Julia yesterday, for finite sample, it may be better to jointly learn imputations and regression together. For me, this was also an interesting result, just because of this for all missing data mechanism, because it means that it holds for missing at random, missing completely at random, and missing non at random. And we know that usually missing non at random is extremely difficult to handle. In a predictive setting, this is a bit different. The picture is different. Okay. So now it seems that I have done my job. I have built my predictive models able to handle missing values with very simple methods. But it turned out that when I looked at the outcome, in fact, that we were predicting, it was not a simple binary outcomes because it had competing events, and more precisely, competing events with death. Because if I look at, for instance, the label neurochirurgy no, it may happen that it is no simply because my patient has died before having the time to receive neurochirurgy. So then here in this plot, we can see the negative label of neurochirurgy. I have in green people who are alive, in red people who are dead, and among these dead, I have people who are dead after 24 hours. And because I am interested in early intervention, it is okay to consider that they have no intervention. But for the people who are dead before 24 hours, it's not so clear to label these people with an outcome equal to no. So maybe they should have received neurochirurgy to improve their care, but they just didn't have time because they died before. So in a way, we can see this as a kind of a missing outcome problem because I just don't know what is the label for these patients. And to handle missing outcomes, there are many different strategies that you can use. Either you can use some weighting strategies. So for instance, you are going to reweight the patients with observed outcomes so that they look like the patients with missing outcomes. But at the end of the day, in fact, we simply excluded these patients. So it represents 900 patients over my 65,000 patients patients, just because we have done a lot of sensitivity analysis looking at the differences between patients with observed and missing outcomes, at the different methods to handle this, and it does not change anything in terms of overall performance and even in terms of nearly individual predictions. Okay, so as I told you, I need to build my model to rely only on pre-hospital features, but in fact I had another constraint, is that I cannot use like the 300 features, because in deployment my models will be used at the SAMU dispatch, and so they will not have time in this critical environment to enter 300 features. So basically they can only fill a form with around like 10 features, because as I say, it's not automatic, and I just don't want to disrupt their workflow. And so consequently, I have to select like the best 10 variables to predict. And so among the 300, you can use different methods to select the best 10 variables. So this was not the difficult part. The difficult part for me was to know which variable I can use, because all the variables do not play the same role. So some variables are really clinical measurements, like blood pressure of your patients, but some variables are interventions. So for instance, intubation. So intubation is really a decision made by the doctor. So the doctor has decided to intubate the patients. And of course, such variables can be highly predictive because they are markers of the severity. So if you intubate the patient, it's basically that the patient is not in such a good state. But it's a bit weird to use like decision by medical doctors for my predictive models. And second, in fact, these variables also reflect local trauma system practices, because we have to know that each healthcare system has its own organizational context and his own organizational and his own clinical practices. And so it really differs among healthcare systems around the world. And consequently, if I use this variable in my model, then I will not be generalizable, in the sense that I cannot use the same model everywhere. And for the medical doctors, it's really a huge concern, because they won't have also in the medical journals to show that they can generalize. But for me, we have to nuance a bit this, because generalizability does not mean that you need to use the same model everywhere, but maybe that you can share the same recipe, the same methodological framework, but for sure you will need to adjust and to adopt, modify to fit your model towards your organizational context. So at the end of the day, for one of my outcomes, we have decided to keep these interventional variables because I will deploy in the French system. So it's helpful to predict, I can use it. Okay, so at this stage, I have a last constraint for my models, is that the clinicians, they don't want to miss like critical patients, and so basically they want to limit the false negative while keeping the false positive manageable. And so they told us like to try to keep the false negative rate at around like 50%. So we have like selected our threshold to meet this constraint, and so we have FNR close to 15%, and the false positive rate is for them manageable, like around 30%. And here you can see the performances of the models on classical predictive metrics, and we can also see that they are quite similar. So at this stage now, it's become like very important to kind of quantify the uncertainty associated to the prediction. So we have our model able to handle missing values, we have dealt with these missing outcomes, we have the features, but I'm never going to give this model to the doctors. I really want some kind of models able to say, I don't know when they don't know, and to predict when they know. And so to quantify the uncertainty, we have used two different solutions. So for probability forest, we have used what is implemented by default in the GRF software. And basically, for probability forest, you predict the probability that your patient has neurochirurgy need neurochirurgy given the features, but you can get a confidence interval associated. So on this plot, I have represented, it's not so clear, like on the x-axis some patients, on the y-axis the prediction, so you predict that the probability for these patients is around like 0.3, and then I have a confidence interval with my probability for rest. I can also have a confidence interval using logistic regression because I will have an explicit parametric form. Interestingly, the guarantees of such an approach are asymptotic, but conditional. It means conditional on the patient's characteristic. For XGBoost, we have used another framework to quantify uncertainty, and we have used like the popular framework of conformal prediction. And here I will have uncertainty on the outcome. And so it will output prediction set, so either 0, singleton, 0, 1, or 0, 1, or the empty set. So basically, you have either kind of sure prediction or you don't know, okay? And the conformal predictions comes with finite sample guarantees. That's why it was extremely popular for any distributions. But originally, we have to note that the guarantees are marginal, so it holds on average for your populations and not conditionally on the characteristic of the patients. In addition, as a remark, initially there were no framework to take into account the supplement uncertainty due to missing values in conformal predictions. And so with colleagues, a former PhD student, Margot Zafran, developed an approach to get mask conditional validity because otherwise the coverage can vary greatly depending on the patterns of missing values. But I will not go through details for a matter of time. So that's why I have used like these two models because I have two different ways to quantify uncertainty and so two regimes of predilections and so two assumptions that are different. But now that I have my two ways and two models for a single predictive task, I need to combine them. And so to combine them and to restitute the uncertainty to the clinicians, we have used something very qualitative, a very qualitative aggregations, but that may make sense, hopefully. So what we have done is that for probability for rest, so we consider like a positive prediction as soon as my confidence interval is above the threshold that we have defined to meet the constraint of the false negative rate of 15%. Negative when it is below. And consequently, I will put like a label a prediction high confidence positive when both the XGBoost plus conformal prediction give you a positive answer plus my probability for rest plus confidence interval give me positive. I will label it as high confidence negative when both are negative, uncertain where both are uncertain, and then I will kind of put low confidence positive as soon as one is positive. Because I don't want, like any positive signal, will trigger at least a low confidence alert because I don't want to miss critical patients. So this is very qualitative, and so we have discussed this with the clinicians, but now I need to assess this way of combining the uncertainty. And to assess it, we need to take into account that as soon as you have like uncertain predictions, then your performances will depend on how the clinicians will interpret this uncertain category. And so you can imagine different scenarios. And the most interesting one is maybe like the safety one. And the safety one will correspond to a risk-averse clinicians. So basically, I will consider that as soon as the clinician sees uncertain, he will consider that this is positive. So he will predict hemorrhagic shock or need for neurochirurgy. Okay? And then we have considered other scenarios, but basically in the second scenario, I will evaluate the performances of this kind of categorical qualitative aggregations only on the positive and negative cases. I exclude the uncertain that will be deferred to the clinicians. So I don't know what will happen. And on the last one, I consider only the strongest predictions, so high positive and low high confidence positive and high confidence negative, and I exclude everything. So this is just a first attempt to try to understand, okay, if I give this to the medical doctors, what will happen, and what will happen also in terms of performances. And so if we look at the safety one, so when any uncertain predictions is considered as positive, still I meet the constraint that my false negative range is below 15%, even if it was not optimized for this, but it will come at a cost of a higher false positive rate because it makes sense, because you are very conservative, okay? And then when you go from the first metric to the last scenario, in the last scenario, of course, the performances are improved. So here it was like 40% and before it was 30%. The performances are improved, but it makes sense because I am assessing like the performances on the kind of very confident predictions. And so this is just an attempt, not necessarily the best things to do, but it gives you some ideas. And what can be interesting, and that's what we have not done, is like to try to see if when the algorithm is highly confident in its predictions, the clinicians also. So if the easy cases for the algorithm are also the easy cases for the clinicians, which can be interesting. Okay, and we have done like a last small thing to assess these categorical aggregations, an omission trials, just to see the impact of the missing values in deployment on this categorization and on these 5 categories. And basically here, if we just look at this plot, we can see that as soon as I remove features, then the proportion of patients labeled uncertain is large, is greater. And so this makes sense. I am happy with this. It's the same thing I do not, because I kind of aggregate 2 models, I have not asked for this, but it makes sense because if my SAMU dispatch enters no data, I am happy that the model say, okay, I don't know. I just don't have enough information to be able to do a prediction. So this is a kind of expected behavior. Okay. So now, we have done quite, I felt that at this level we have kind of stress test a lot of models. So we have done a lot of sensitivity analysis for the model, for the method to deal with missing values, the missing values in covariates, the missing values in the outcome, for the variable selections. We have quantified the uncertainty associated to the prediction to be able to output like I don't know when the model don't know. So, and I have done a lot of sensitivity analysis, much more, in fact, that I have not shown. So at this stage, I felt like, okay, it seems I'm happy. But in fact, we have not answered like maybe the main questions is that, okay, how can I know that my models will really improve the care of the patients? And is it the case that these models, when they will be deployed, will improve the care of the patients? And it turns out that it's not obvious, in fact, to answer to these questions because my label is not an objective label, and it often occurs, in fact, in clinical the domain. The label neurochirurgy, when it is known, does not mean that your patient should not have received neurochirurgy to improve its outcome. It just means that the clinician has not performed neurochirurgy. So this label is not objective, it's really a decision made by your clinicians. And so maybe I could have seen it like earlier, because when you look at the clinical definitions of the outcome, it's a bit more complicated, and you understand that it's really a decision made by the outcome, by the clinicians. So it's not really a simple, like, okay, hemorrhagic shock, yes or no. And so what does it mean? It means that your models, in fact, your prediction model is going to learn like an average clinical judgment. And so the clinicians that I'm working with are really aware of this. In fact, they know it because I have told them this at the beginning, in fact. But for them, an average doctor is still better than an exhausted doctor at 3 a.m. in the morning. But still, we have to keep in mind that, in fact, we are going to reproduce existing expertise, existing workflow, and even existing bias. And so highly predictive does not mean necessarily clinically optimal. And so our model really does not answer like which patients benefit from neurochirurgy, for instance, to improve survival. And so if you ask this question in this way, then your question is causal. Then you need to go through policy learning. You need to be able to estimate which action should be taken for each patient. And so we can see it also on this slide. So the questions will change because I'm not going to ask the questions like who historically received neurochirurgy, because this is what you do when you do supervised learning. You are looking for basically nearest neighbor. So if you have a patient with the same characteristic as you who received neurochirurgy, I'm going to predict neurochirurgy. Here the question will become who will benefit from neurochirurgy. And then, to answer these questions, in fact, I need to change because my previous target will become the treatment. So I will have like the patient's characteristics. Then the previous output become a treatment. Either I have neurochirurgy or I don't have neurochirurgy. And then I need an outcome, a new outcome, which is a clinically meaningful outcome, which can be like, for instance, survival at 28th day. And consequently, what we will do is that you are going to compare the patient's expected outcome under this alternative intervention. So I want to predict with this patient's characteristic, if he had neurochirurgy, what will be his outcome? And if he had no neurochirurgy, what will be his outcome? And if the expected outcome is better with neurochirurgy, then I will kind of predict neurochirurgy. So before going into policy learning and detailing it, I just want to show also what can be wrong with the predictive models that we have produced. Is that like in terms of evaluation, if when I deploy, I evaluate my models using the same outcomes as I used to train my models, then I may have the feeling that my model is extremely good and in fact even improve because I can have some kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. So to see this, we can see that, okay, if my model predicts no neurochirurgy, then the clinicians will send this patient to a level 2 or level 3 trauma center where it's impossible to do neurochirurgy. And so the observed outcome will be no neurochirurgy. And so I predict no neurochirurgy. I have no neurochirurgy, so I'm happy. I feel that my model is extremely good. But this is the case because really your prediction influences the decisions, and the decisions will influence the future labels. Okay? And so your model appears to improve just because its prediction modifies the process generating the labels. You can have the same thing if you predict that there is a high chance that your patient is going to die, then the clinician is not going to do some treatment and interventions. Your patient died, but maybe your patient is died because he has not received some treatment. Okay? And so in our settings, this will not be an issue because the outcome we use in our trial to evaluate our models is an independent outcome. So we will evaluate the impact of our models on under and over triage. So let's go back to policy learning. So what is policy learning? You want to find the best treatment to give to each patient to maximize expected outcome. And more precisely, you want to maximize like the value, so the expected outcome if everybody followed your policy, were treated according to your policy. So here it will be the expected 28-day survivals. And under classical causal assumptions of no measure confounding and so on, you have like a plenty methods that you can use. So you can use policy tree, you can use conditional average treatment effect-based methods, X, R, DLR learner, and so on. And so all these methods can give you different treatment, which can be really a barrier towards adoptions, because for the clinicians and for the patients, it's a bit weird to have like all these choices, even though you can have recommended a different treatment which makes sense, even though like the value can be non-significantly different from each other. So here I have represented the proportion of patients recommended for neurochirurgy using different policy learning methods, and you can see that it varies. I have also represented like the individual recommendations, so you can see that for my patient 1, the 4 methods that I have selected like recommend no neurochirurgy, but for the third patients, like 2 methods recommend neurochirurgy and 2 methods do not recommend neurochirurgy. But for me, like the main barriers toward adoption, it was because all these methods, they just output you a single recommendation, a single treatment, and they do not quantify the uncertainty associated to the recommendation of treatment. And for me, it does not make sense, especially because you can have two treatments that are equivalent in the sense that it will give you the same expected outcome. And imagine the situation where there is no treatment effect, then outputting and forcing your algorithm to output one treatment does not make any sense. And this problem is even exacerbated if you consider that you have like categorical treatment, dose 1, dose 2, dose 3, dose 4, dose 5. If dose 1 is non-significantly different from dose 2, in the sense that it will give you the same expected outcome, then it makes more sense to output a set with dose 1, dose 2, rather than just picking one dose at random. And if dose 1, dose 2, dose 3, dose 5, and there is no effect, then you can output the complete set. So for me, this was really important. And so consequently, with colleagues and PhD student, Laura Fuentes, she has developed like set value policy learning to be able to return a set of treatment. And so she used, like it is based on IDs from conformal prediction with noisy labels. And because there were not a lot of like competitors, in fact, we have compared this method against what I was doing in practice. And in practice, in fact, I was like running the 20 policy learning methods. I was looking at the different recommendations, and either I was doing like majority vote or drawing from the distribution of the labels. And this approach is also interesting because then the clinicians, if you output a set, he can use additional constraints to select the best treatment among this set. So for instance, if dose 2 has less side effects than dose 1, then he can select dose 2. So it fits within the kind of learning to differ approach. And it's also interesting because sometimes you just don't know, in fact, like the constraint in advance. And so we have like performed our set value policy learning methods, and we have compared it with the TROMATRIX prediction. So TROMATRIX prediction, we do not use any survival, and we use it a bit as a kind of a causal audit. And so basically, what do we have is that like with our set value policy learning methods, where also we have done a lot of sensitivity analysis, basically when it predicts that the patient should receive neurochirurgy to improve survival, then, in fact, our TROMATRIX models also predict positive. So basically, the prediction align with treatment decision estimated to maximize 28-day survival, and patients predicted to benefit from neurochirurgy are classified neurochirurgy. So it's kind of reassuring. So basically, even though I have not done policy learning, it's kind of close to having done policy learning. And I will tell you also why I'm not implementing policy learning in practice, and I still use my predictive model. But this is a kind of reassuring. Okay, so as I told you, like we are on his way to be deployed, so how it will go. So basically, when people will have an accident, you have like the first emergency responders that collect the information, they call the dispatch, then at the SAMU dispatch, like the SAMU dispatcher enters the data in the form that I will just show just after, review the model predictions, and he will take the final decision. So basically, he is responsible. And then for them, it's really, the model predictions are really seen as just an additional parameter that will help them to take their decisions. And then we will follow patient's outcome. And so the form is as follows. It's not so clear. So basically, how does it work? So first, we ask Ma Vision Médecin, so we ask like the clinical decisions before entering any data and before seeing any predictions. And so basically, it's written like, okay, what is the probability that the patients need neurochirurgy or hemorrhagic shock? Very low, low, very high, high, or uncertain, because it's also interesting to kind of capture the uncertainty associated with the human decisions. So we ask them this, then we ask, okay, where do you want to send your patient? Trauma center level 1, level 2. After that, they fill in the form. So here, there is the age, pupils anomaly, yes or no, heart rate, and so on. So the 10 features that we have selected. And then we output the result of our predictive model, risk of hemorrhagic shock and neurochirurgy. And we have these 5 categories that correspond to the 5 categories of my matrix. So here it's high, so it corresponds to high confidence positive, okay? And when it's uncertain, and high confidence negative. So we output this, and then we ask the clinician, the SAMU dispatchers, okay, now where are you going to send the patients? So level 1, level 2, level 3. So basically, if I just compare what was done before and enter here, I will see how the model has changed the decision by the clinicians. And then we also ask them what is the real orientation, because you can have like practical constraint. So even though there is a high risk that your patients do an hemorrhagic shock and you need to send them to a level 1 trauma center, maybe the level 1 trauma center is too far, and so it's better to send him to a level 2 to avoid a long transfer. So you can have, like, it can change because what you want to do and what you will do. And so this is, as I say, like a national, cluster crossover randomized trial. So we will have 16 regions in France. And so the first 8 regions will be in the treated groups for 9 months. Then there is a washout period. Then there will be in the control group. And for the 8 other regions, it will be the sequence will be inverted. And basically, what we are going to assess with this trial is really the impact of this decision aid on the triage. And so in the treatment group, basically, you will see like the clinician plus the algorithm. And in the control group, you will see only like the clinicians. So in fact, you are never going to see the impact of the algorithm alone, even though you can use some kind of counterfactual reasoning to try also to predict this impact of the algorithm alone. Okay. And so I have presented a lot of things related to what we have done regarding the machine learning sides. But of course, if you want to deploy such a system, there are many other things. So you have to go through the regulatory requirements. You need to have patient consent. And you can imagine that patient consent in the kind of car accident, and this kind of accident is complicated. You have to be sure that you will not have technical barriers in all the hospitals. You have to train the dispatchers. And we have tried also to incorporate social science researchers from the beginning to help us like to create the interface so that it will not disrupt the workflow. And they will also be observing the trials, so they will be observing like how the clinicians are interacting with the tool, if they change their behavior and so on. So there will be a lot of ancillary studies. So to conclude this journey, we can give like few lessons for safe clinical AI. So I would say that for me, the most important thing is to do a lot of sensitivity analysis and really to document these choices. And you want to see the impact of your choices on the results. So we have seen all these kind of different analyses on algorithm, variable selection, missing values, and they were much more on fairness, distributional shift, and so on. So at the end of the day, even if I am scared, I am a bit confident that what we have implemented is okay, at least it's stable and even really close at the individual predictions. We have quantified uncertainty associated to the predictions, and we have really documented and traced all our choices. So it aligns with the kind of veridical science, data science like a principle, and also with the principles that Julia mentioned yesterday. Maybe the main limitations, we have done something in 2 steps. I train on historical data, and I will deploy with the clinicians. So it's a bit weird because from the outset, maybe it will be better to learn to train your algorithm with the clinicians, and for instance, so that your algorithm is good when the clinician is not good. It's not necessarily easy to do. It's not easy to do because you have also an heterogeneity and a lot of uncertainty to take into account among the clinicians. We now have to take into account that we are going to modify the data if I train future models, so we will be a bit in the paradigm of completely in the paradigm of performative predictions. And maybe main limitation is that I have not done like policy learning, even though it seems like the best thing that we could do. But I have not done policy learning because also policy learning require a lot of assumptions. To meet these assumptions, for instance, unmeasured confoundings, I know that I have a lot of unmeasured confoundings. We know this, so you need a lot of sensitivity analysis. And to be honest, when I have started this project, policy learning for me was not at all mature to be deployed. So there is a lot of difference between the method that you do in research and what you really want to implement in practice. So quantifying uncertainty in policy learning, for me, it's like huge, it's really important. And the devils are in the details, because in the method what I have presented, I'm close to use it for deployment, but not yet. You know, it needs a lot of assessment. And still, the clinicians are happy, because for them, like, it's, even though we are not going to outperform maybe clinicians, it will reduce their load. It may help them in difficult cases. And for them, just the fact that they will fill a form is something that can help. So to see this, in fact, I will need like a 3 arms trial. I don't have this, but like hopefully we will have the trials to establish our clinical utility. So I just want to thank all the people, institutions involved in this project, especially like Dia, the engineer in my team, who help us a lot to be able to deploy. Yes, and also like all the other students. And I have presented what we have implemented, but using this data, we have developed it. It was a source of inspiration for a lot of methods, especially like for federated causal inference, because we don't have only data at the French level, but we have at the European level. But it's not in the deployment phase. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Questions? There's one there. There's volunteers with microphones, if you could, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. One concern with AI platforms with like healthcare would be potential of racial bias. I was wondering if the model detected any racial bias in terms of like assessments, or did you account for that, or preemptively kind of look out for that in your model?
We have done like a bit a posteriori assessment of fairness. So fairness was not included like in the development of the models. We have not looked at race. In fact, to be honest, we have looked at severity and age, because age for them was a main concern. Like, okay, maybe, and sex also, because I deal with, you know, it's car accident, issue with weapons. So in my data, I have a lot of men, which is a bit caricatural. And so you may fear that, okay, I'm sure that I'm going to treat well the woman. So given the nature, in fact, of the data we'll deal with, we have looked at other details. And I'm not sure I have any race, in fact, in my data. In fact, I just don't have this variable also.
Thank you.
There's one in the way back there, I think. And then
yeah. Thank you very much for the great presentation and great and interesting work. I have a practical question regarding the model that you used. Did you use the tree-based or causal tree-based, like GRF? Because as if I understood correctly, you have to, in your work, to identify what treatment benefits the patient, right?
So for the development of the model that will be implemented, it's only probability for us, because we are just doing like classical classification task and prediction task. For the policy learning part, we have used different, in fact, policy learning methods to be able to build our set value policy method. And among them, we have used like causal forest.
Like GRF?
Yes.
And I was wondering, what was your confidence interval rates? And the intervals of your confidence for the ATE, or if you could also show the ITE, individual treatment effect?
Yes, so because our method like output a set, basically, we need to fix like a threshold to have like coverage guarantees. And so we fix an alpha equal to different alpha, in fact. So maybe to have like a 90% coverage guarantee.
Okay,
just because we use like conformal prediction on the top of this.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. Very inspirational. I also work in healthcare. I have a question concerning the distribution shift that might happen. So as you probably very well know, something's going to change in the patient population that your model will be used on. So maybe there is a new policy about the use of electric bikes. Maybe the clinicians get new tools in the ambulance. Could be many things. So what strategy have you and your team thought about to manage this risk or this problem of the model seeing patients that are quite different from what they're trained on?
Yeah, we had this like electrical bikes, for instance, but it was mainly a problem of missing values because at some point you just don't have like these electric scooters. And then we had like electric scooters, and so it leads to different kind of brain trauma, in fact. But for me, it was better because I have more overlap, so it was exciting. But basically, it was more like missing values, so it was a bit of shift in terms of kind of missing values, but I considered it as missing before. And then after I had like these values, so this was not so complicated to handle. Then we have assessed like a bit of temporal shift just to see like if things varies across like the 10 years of data that I have, and it was not really the case. But for me, the main concern was the distributed shift in terms of population, because I trained on a certain population, this observational registry, but when I will deploy, it will not be exactly the same population, exactly at the same time, and so on. And so basically, I've tried a lot of different weighting strategies to say, oh, what would happen if I will see much more like severe patients appearing. So I tried to kind of put a lot of weights to the most severe or less severe, and just to see how things vary. So it's the only thing, and then we will monitor what will happen over time. So there were few like shifts in the data that we have for now. And just I have tried a bit of weighting strategies to see, okay, if this change. And we will monitor. I cannot do, more.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think it's worth maybe implementing an abstain mechanism if you can detect auto-distribution patients in real time?
So what mechanism? Sorry, I have not...
So to detect the shifts,
Yeah,
you will
yeah,
have
yeah.
to wait a certain amount of patients to go through the system
Yeah,
and record
yeah,
them. And
yeah.
in the meantime, you can do a lot of bad decisions.
Yes.
So
This
would it
is a
be-
bit, this is a concern because in the trial you cannot interfere with the trial, you know.
Of course not.
So
not in
yes. So because of this, I am scared also a lot. We can monitor and then do things after, but I guess you can stop it if things are really bad, and so this will still be possible, but it will be either stop or wait, I think.
Thanks.
One more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is a high-risk application, so this would raise the need to make this interpretable. Do you have any ideas?
To
make this explainable or interpretable? Do you have any plans for doing this?
In fact, you can use like a variable importance and all the techniques to find what we have done. In fact, like the relevant, we have discussed a lot, like the variables that we have used. Then to more explain the decisions, you can explain also with kind of variable importance tools like the decisions in the policy learning setting. So this is possible also to have some kind of variable importance. Then not much more like... like they are kind of happy enough with like, the evidences that we bring to be able to use it quite confidently, in fact. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're at time then. Let's thank our speaker, Julie Jost, one more time. Thanks so much.